Welcome back to a Wednesday night Bible study. We're looking at the story of David. This is our 13th installment. I'm calling this one Grace, and we're in 2 Samuel chapter 9. We're going to look at chapter 9 tonight. So last week, we saw how David's good intentions didn't work out as planned. David wanted to build his temple for God. Through the prophet Nathan, God told David no. But God promised David some wonderful things. I will give you rest from all your enemies. I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of the earth. I will provide a place for my people Israel. God also promised Solomon, David's son, would build the temple, and that David's dynasty would be a lasting one. But there was also a covenant which was much more than the promises. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 16, your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. So God would build an eternal house, a dynasty that would lead all the way to the King of Kings, Christ himself. And David's reaction to all this, even the no on the temple, he showered God with praise and faith. And David spent the rest of his time as king preparing for the temple without building it. Today we'll look at a story of David from 2 Samuel chapter 9, a story about grace. Patterning his heart after God's, David shows grace to someone. The story begins years earlier with two promises David made. One to his dearest friend, and that was Jonathan, his dearest friend. The other to his bitterest enemy. And who would that be? That would be Saul, Jonathan's father. The first comes from 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 13. Anticipating the day David would become king, Jonathan asked his friend, verse 13, may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. But show me unfailing kindness like that of the Lord as long as you live. As long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth. So in those days, an incoming king would hunt down and kill the previous king's family. This would eliminate the possibility of retaliation, and it would also eliminate any future battle for the throne. But David vowed to Jonathan that he would spare him and his family. David would show kindness. Another way to translate it would be grace. So David showed grace. Love expressed through kindness. That word kindness or grace specifically is the demonstration of love toward those who don't deserve it and who can't repay. David understood the concept of grace. God's grace had flowed through his life in his protection and strength. Now the second promise was between David and Saul. Saul also knew in his heart that David would be king someday. In 1 Samuel 24, starting with verse 20, I know that you will surely be king and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. And here we go, 21, now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. The way Paul treated David could have rightfully taken his request and ignored it. But David, with grace, pledged to honor Saul's request. So a lot had happened since David made his promises. We know what happened to both Saul and Jonathan. They died in battle. And after some battling, David became king over all Israel. All that success and power didn't change David. He was still a man of his word, and he wouldn't forget his promises. So let's begin 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 1. David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? So David wants to know if there are any descendants of Saul still living. But unlike other kings, he doesn't want them killed. He wants to show kindness. There's that word translated grace again. He doesn't care if they are deserving or qualified. He doesn't want them to be indebted. He just wants to show love for the sake of his friend Jonathan. He wants to show unconditional, free love to that person. And then verse 2, now there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They called him to appear before David, and the king said to him, are you Ziba? Your servant, he replied. The king asked, is there no one still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness? Ziba answered the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet. Where is he? The king asked. Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Amiel in Lodebar. Don't try to learn those pronunciations from me. So King David had him brought from Lodebar, from the house of Machir, son of Amiel. So there is someone, a crippled son of Jonathan. He's living at that place, Lodebar. Its name means no pasture, a wasteland. Jonathan's son lives as an outcast in a barren place, far from royal estates. David had this person brought to him. We can find out earlier in 2 Samuel chapter 4 what really happened to Jonathan's son. Why was he crippled? Sad events happened when Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle. In chapter 4, it was just an aside, a parenthetical statement, but in chapter 4, verse 4, Jonathan, son of Saul, had a son who was lame in both feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. His nurse picked him up and fled, but as she hurried to leave, he fell and became crippled. His name was Mephibosheth. His name is Mephibosheth, meaning one who scatters shame. His name is a mouthful, and I'm going to start calling him Meph, okay? Because we're going to see his name a lot, Meph. He's had a hard life from an early age. So back to the story, Meph arrives to meet David in 2 Samuel 9, verse 6. When Meph, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Meph, your servant, he replied. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. So what do you suppose the crippled man was expecting? I would think that he would be expecting death, fearing for his life. He was probably very afraid. But what he got was words of grace. David was showering him with grace. Meph bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Then the king summoned Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and your servants are to farm the land for him and bring in the crops, so that your master's grandson may be provided for. And Meph, grandson of your master, will always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, your servant will do whatever my lord the king commands his servant to do. So Meph ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Meph had a young son named Micah, and all the members of Ziba's household were servants of Meph. And Meph lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table, and he was crippled in both feet. So Meph received wonderful kindness. He received grace. What had he done to merit such kindness? He did nothing. Had he deserved it, it wouldn't have been grace. Grace is acceptance without reservation. Grace is forgiveness without condemnation. Grace is pardon without punishment. Grace is unrestrained love poured out on the undeserving. So the story ends with a wonderful picture of Meph dining at the king's table, being treated like one of the king's own children. So this Bible study, the story of David, is a long one. This could have been one, to shorten it, I could have not included it in the study, but it's such a good, inspiring story. What David did is something for us to always try to model, so I couldn't leave it out. Do you see how David's grace to Meph is like God's grace to us? A great example of God's grace to us. Chuck Swindoll wrote about this very thing, and he came up with 8 analogies or similarities that connect David's grace to Mephibosheth with God's grace to us. Once, Meph had enjoyed fellowship with his father, and so had humanity in the Garden of Eden. That's number 1. Number 2, Meph suffered a fall that crippled him for the rest of his life. When sin came, humanity suffered a fall which has forever left us spiritually crippled. 3, out of unconditional love for his friend Jonathan, David sought anyone to whom he might extend his grace. God, because of his unconditional love for his son and acceptance of his son's death on the cross, continues to seek anyone to whom he might extend his grace. 4, the crippled man was destitute and undeserving. All he could do was accept David's favor. We sinners are undeserving and without hope. In no way are we worthy of God's favor. All we can do is humbly and gratefully accept it. David took the crippled Meph, this is number 5, from a barren wasteland and seated him at the royal banquet table in the palace. God has rescued us from a moral wasteland and seated us in a place of spiritual nourishment and intimacy. Number 6, David adopted Meph into his royal family, providing him with every blessing within the palace. We have been adopted into God's family, and he gives us full privileges within his household. Number 7, Meph's limp was a constant reminder of David's grace. For us, our moral feebleness keeps us from ever forgetting that where sin abounds, grace abounds that much more. And 8, when Meph sat at David's table, he was treated with the same respect as David's own sons. Just as when we one day attend the great wedding feast of the Lamb, the same will be true for us. We will sit with prophets and priests, apostles and evangelists, pastors and missionaries. We will dine with everyone from the Apostle Peter to Billy Graham, and we'll be there with them because grace covers us all. And that concludes tonight, and so everyone be safe and take care. May the Lord be with you.